I've been a little worried about my truck lately. Not the engine or the transmission or the exhaust. I've been worried about my truck's soul of late. My truck just doesn't seem very religious, at least not as religious as other people's trucks. Just this week I was stuck in traffic on 630, and right in front of me was a truck that had bumper stickers all over it. On this side of the center section it said, "God is in control." And on this side of the center section it said, "Blessed." These bumper stickers were positioned between other bumper stickers touting the driver's political affiliations and alumni association of his alma mater. And up on the back window was another bumper sticker which read, "In case of rapture, this truck will be left unmanned." So we were stuck on 630, and all I had to think about was what I saw on those bumper stickers. First of all, I asked my truck why he didn't have any bumper stickers, and he rolled his headlights and said, "I don't like to wear my religion on my bumper." Good enough for me. Secondly, we were there long enough that I actually began to wonder if the rapture had really happened, and that's why there was a traffic jam on 630. And wouldn't you know, I was left behind. But it gives me comfort because so were all of you if the rapture happened. The thought crossed my mind that when you put your faith right between your alumni association and your political affiliations, it makes them seem like they're of equal importance, you know. I guess for some people they are. The more I thought about all this, the less I understood it. And so I came back to that one bumper sticker which read, "God is in control." Simple enough. But then it was a big traffic jam. I began to wonder, how in control is God? Is that a fair question? How in control is God? You know, there are people who believe that God is in control of everything, and by everything, I mean everything. R.C. Sproul, a longtime favorite devotional writer of many Christians, once wrote, and I quote, "If there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled. Without sovereignty, God cannot be God. If we reject divine sovereignty, then we must embrace atheism." Unquote. Really? Not one molecule running around loose, free from God's sovereignty? I don't know about that. Can people run around loose, free from God's sovereignty? Do we have our own free will to act outside of the will of God? Are we really free to make our own decisions, or is it just the illusion of freedom? What about nature? Does nature have any sort of freedom from God? Or is every hurricane and wildfire and drought sent from the heavens? What about evil? If God is in control of every little thing, then where does evil come from? If you believe that God is in control of every little molecule, then logically, when you trace evil back, don't you end up putting it at the feet of God? What about suffering children and unexplainable death? Is it God's doings when a terrorist group beheads those who fall outside the purview of their ideology and violence carries the day? Is God in control then? If God is in control of all this, then isn't suffering laid at the feet of God? We skimmed over this quickly last week, but this actually seems to be something like Naomi's view of things, at least at the first part of the book. Naomi left her town of Bethlehem because of a famine. In a short period of time in Moab, she lost her husband and 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And when she returned to Bethlehem 10 years later, all that she had was a daughter-in-law, a Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth, who would not let her go. When Naomi returned to Bethlehem, she said to the other women of the town, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She said, "Call me Marah," which means bitter. And then she says, listen closely, "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The Almighty has afflicted me, she says. Naomi believed that God was in control. And because of that, she blamed God for all of her pain and suffering. It really is the only logical conclusion for someone who believes that. If we thank God for all the good things of life, who do we blame for the bad things? She puts all her suffering, all her heartache at the feet of the Almighty, the one in control. Well, the famine ended in Bethlehem. Things got better in Bethlehem, but not for Naomi and Ruth. I don't know what would be worse, for no one to have food or for everyone to have food except you. Anyway, here Naomi and Ruth were, two single women in a man's world. In those days, a woman's identity stemmed from her nearest male kin, so a widow was in a sense a nobody. They had no one to provide for them, no one to protect them, no one to earn money. And if all that wasn't enough, Ruth was a foreigner, a stranger, an alien in this land. Here is a family, an unorthodox family, which has slipped through the cracks of society with no safety net to catch them. Nobodies, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to care for them. I'm sure their souls were as hungry as their bellies were. But the Jewish law made provision for people who might otherwise slip through the cracks. I might argue with the video we watched just a little today. It wasn't just that people, the poor, went through the fields getting the grain that was left behind after the harvesters had finished. It wasn't exactly that. The Jewish law commanded that the landowners, if they were obedient to the law, they were to leave the outskirts of their field unharvested, so that everyone would have something to eat. The good grain isn't on the outskirts of the fields anyway. Let's just leave the outskirts of the fields for the poor. It was a way of looking out for the least amongst them, the ancient version of Social Security. And so Ruth headed out to the fields to glean the grain at the edges of the fields. And verse 3 of chapter 2 says, she happened to come to the portion of field belonging to Boaz. It's emphasized in the original language. She happened onto the field of Boaz. You get the feeling it was just chance, coincidence, happenstance that led her onto the fields of Boaz. I'm sure it was to them, just happenstance, just a stroke of good luck. But more times than not, God's sovereignty over this world is experienced as coincidence within this world. And so Ruth happens onto Boaz's field. Now, Boaz was a prominent man in that community, a man of means, influence. He's on the opposite end of the social spectrum as Ruth and Naomi. I've been taught to pay close attention to how characters are introduced in narratives. Pay attention to the first words of characters. In literature, as in life, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. As Boaz enters the narrative, his first words are, "The Lord be with you." And his workers respond back, "May the Lord bless you." Boaz's story, from the beginning of this story, Boaz's role in this story, in the beginning of it, from the beginning of it, is to bless. Yes, Boaz is blessed, but he's blessed to bless. Boaz didn't just walk around saying, "I'm blessed." He didn't just have a bumper sticker on his F-150 which read, "Blessed." People in our day focus on being blessed. Boaz wanted to be a blessing. And he used his blessings as a blessing, which is an idea that's as old as Abraham. And so Boaz wanders out to his fields and begins to inquire about Ruth. He sees Ruth. She looks out of place. Who is she? What man does she belong to? What's her story? And so his workers begin to report to him Ruth's story. She's the Moabitess who clung to Naomi, followed her back to Bethlehem. Did you hear that? She's the Moabitess. She's not mentioned by name. She's mentioned by category. We do that, you know. We categorize people. It's a way of dehumanizing them in a nice way. We speak in generalities so that we can oppress in specificity, like the poor. If the poor would just go out and get a job, we say, we group them all into one category. The poor just need to get a job. We think if there's only one cause, there must be only one solution. It simplifies things. The poor, the liberals, the fundamentalists, the Muslims. We categorize people because when we do so, we can cut through broad sections of the population without seeing so much as one single human face. But as we all know, one human face has the potential to outweigh even the broadest of the categories. And so Boaz approached Ruth. Listen carefully, my daughter. Did you hear that? Some of his first words to Ruth. Listen carefully, my daughter. Here Ruth is, a stranger in a strange land, no man to care for her, and this man of prominence says to her, listen carefully, my daughter. Don't go to any other fields, stay in mine. I'll be sure you're taken care of. You see, since the outskirts of the fields were where the poor and the vulnerable frequented, it was also a place which was frequented by crime. The outskirts of fields were dangerous places. They were the dark alleys of the ancient world. Boaz says, I want you to stay with my servants. Stay here in my fields. My servants will protect you. And because she was with his servants, she wasn't just relegated to the outskirts of the fields. She could go into the middle of the fields and get the good stuff. Boaz went above and beyond what was expected of him. And Ruth fell on her face before him and asked why he was so good to her. Why have I found favor in your sight, a foreigner in this land? And Boaz says to Ruth, I've heard how you've taken care of your mother-in-law, Naomi. You went above and beyond. I guess Ruth is now reaping what she had sown. Perhaps the most surprising part of all this is that Boaz did not overlook her. I'm sure Boaz was busy thinking about his city council responsibilities and fields to oversee and workers to manage. It would have been so easy for Boaz to be too busy or too important or too fearful or too anything to take care of Ruth. And I'm sure there were people murmuring about her picking the grain. You know how we are. The more grain this Moabitess picks, the less the rest there is for the rest of us. Shouldn't we take care of our own first? I'm sure there were people who saw her as a pest. Some people saw her as an intrusion on their lives. Some people saw her as a parasite on society. But Boaz seems to be one who saw her as a person. Not a Moabitess, not a pest, not an intrusion, not a parasite or a threat, a person. And when all was said and done, he sent her home with an ephah of flour. When I did the mathematics of the thing, I equaled 42 quarts. 42 quarts of barley for 2 women. That's a lot of Ziploc containers. 42 quarts of barley. Ruth says to Boaz, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me. Now, Lord here could be rendered sir. She's just minding her manners. I found favor in your sight, sir. But maybe the word Lord here alludes to something a little more. Maybe Boaz is how the Lord is with Ruth and Naomi in this story. In chapter 2, just like chapter 1, God is in the shadows of this story. God doesn't say anything. God doesn't do anything in Ruth chapter 2. There's nothing miraculous. There's nothing that even smells like heaven. It's just a tale of human suffering, 2 lonely widows trying to make their way in the world. God doesn't do anything. God's not even a character in the story. If you didn't know better, you would think God was absent. Where is God when you bury your husband and 2 sons? Where is God when you're an alien in a strange land? Different culture, different people, different language. Where is God when you're trying to find food in the middle of a famine? The problem with pain and suffering is that it makes you feel so alone, so forsaken. But in this story, God is very present through the actions of Boaz towards Ruth. Many, many years ago, there was a Jewish family that lived near a synagogue. It was harvest time and they had gathered the grain, and so the mother of the home began baking bread, and she wanted to teach her children about sacrifice. So when the first loaf came out of the oven, the mother sent it by her children down the street to the synagogue, and she instructed her children to place the bread upon the altar as a gift to God, a sacrifice to God. And so the children did. Well, around mid-morning, after the children had gone, a hungry, starving man stumbled into the synagogue and laid down on the back pew and prayed to the Lord, "I'm starving. If you can provide any sort of food for me, I would appreciate it." And he rose from his prayer and stood up, and there on the altar was this golden, glistening, recently baked bread. He wasn't much on church in those days, and so he sprinted up to the altar and devoured the bread. He didn't know it was for God. He ate it as quickly as he could eat it. Left the building. The next morning, when the first loaf of bread came out of the oven, the mother sent it by the children down to the synagogue to place it upon the altar as a gift to God. And the children brought the bread, placed it on the altar, and were awestruck and filled with wonder when they looked to the side. And the plate from yesterday was empty, only crumbs left on it. And they thought, God consumed our bread. And they raced home to tell their mother that God had eaten their bread. Later that day, the hungry man said, if it worked once, maybe it'll work twice. Stumbled into the sanctuary, and there, to his dismay, was another freshly baked loaf of bread on the altar. The children showed up the next day. The hungry man showed up the next day. This went on for days, until one day the mother was a little late getting the bread out of the oven, and the children were a little later bringing it into the sanctuary. The children brought it in, placed the bread on the altar, only to hear a noise from the back of the sanctuary. And the children thought God was coming in to eat His mid-morning snack. And so the children hid over to the side of the sanctuary. And in stumbled this starving man off the streets. And to their horror, the man walked down the center aisle and picked up the loaf of bread and opened his mouth. And the children said, "Wait! Don't eat that. That bread's for God." And the man said, "You've been bringing this bread?" And the children said, "You've been eating this bread?" And there was commotion in the synagogue. The priest heard it and ran in. And the man said to the priest, "I thought God was providing this bread for me." And the children said, "We thought God was eating our bread." And the wise priest thought for a second, and he said, "You're both right. You're both right." He was. I tell you, friends, it's never made much sense to me to try to untangle the hand of God and the good deeds of human beings in this world. I don't know how to untangle them. I feel like I'm trying to separate the white from the rice or the hot from the fire. Jesus didn't seem to care much for this dichotomy either. Did you hear what He said earlier in the service? Whatever you did for the least of these, or didn't do for the least of these, you did or didn't do for me. The interesting part to me is both groups don't get it. Both groups say, when? When did we see you? Jesus, we worked as a server in the soup kitchen, but we never saw you in that line. Jesus, we visited the prisons, but we never saw you behind those bars. Jesus, we put a roof over the homeless, but we never saw you sleeping on one of those cots. When? Maybe that's why we struggle to see God in stories like this. Stories of loss and struggle and pain. Just like chapter 1, God is silent. He doesn't do anything. He seems absent. And we think if God was in the story, we wouldn't have to deal with things like this. We look to the heavens for someone who is in control, someone who can get us out of the mess, someone who can manipulate the molecules from the heavenly control room. When the place we should look, if we really want to see God, is the outskirts of the barley fields, amidst the poor and the outcast and the alien and the vulnerable and the widow. Brothers and sisters, God's sovereign rule over creation is never manifest as power from the heavens. God's sovereign rule over creation is manifested as love and provision in the corners of the wheat fields. It's just that we don't ever think to look for God out there. God is not just big enough. God's small enough too. And maybe this is the word for God, the word from God for all of us today. Maybe this is it. Before we can be Christ to people, we must first see Christ in people. Now that won't fit on a bumper sticker, but it might just fit perfectly in our hearts. And if it did, it might just change us. It might just change the world. Who knows? Would you pray with me? Lord, we believe in your power. We have seen your power. And yet, we know full well that your power always comes to us in the form of love. Help us not to look to the heavens so much as we look to the corners of the wheat fields. Help us not so much to reach for power and control as we reach for love and grace and justice. Help us to be your hands and feet. And now, Lord, speak to us as we continue to think on these things.